Cass R. Sunstein is a renowned legal scholar known for his work in behavioral economics, constitutional law, and regulatory policy. He is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School and founder of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Professor Sunstein also served as senior counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security during the Biden administration and was awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal, the department's highest civilian honor in 2024. Professor Sunstein is author of hundreds of articles and dozens of influential books, including Nudge, Simpler, The Future of the Government, The Ethics of Influence, How Change Happens, and his most recent books, Climate Justice and On Liberalism. Everyone, please welcome Professor Cass Sunstein.
Thank you so much. It's a complete honor to be there, even in this way. I wish I were there with you personally, but to be with you in this way is an honor and a thrill, and it's completely an inspiration that you're focusing on this topic. I thought I'd just say three things. The first is that the focus on animal welfare as something that matters is something of great importance, and it seems that it ought to be bedrock for our discussions. So Americans love dogs or cats or horses, and the idea that an animal's well-being matters seems to be something that, on reflection, everyone will agree with. How much it matters and how to handle trade-offs between animal welfare and other things, that's completely fair to discuss. But by all means, let's stand on a foundation, which is suffering to animals matters and is a bad thing. So the second point, which has to do with AI, is that there's unprecedented opportunities with AI to help people make choices that fit with the full range of things they care about, including their tastes and their preferences and their moral values. So if you want to make a choice, for example, that is better for dogs and cats and horses and pigs and cows, it's really easier to do that than it's ever been, and AI can help. So the second point is that we are seeing the rise of something we might call choice engines, which are online mechanisms frequently powered with AI, where people can make choices that fit with their values and their preferences. And with respect to animals, that's a fantastic and unprecedented opportunity that people can easily find out what are better choices if they care a little bit about animal welfare, or what are better choices if they care a lot about animal welfare. So it would be fantastic to see the rise of choice engines. I combined animal and choice, which shows you how my mind's working. Let's call them chanimal engines, choice engines for animals, which are designed specifically to enable people and maybe to nudge people to make choices that are consistent with widely held and laudable moral values. The third point is the most delicate of the three. And let's note that, as Peter Singer and others have emphasized, cruelty to and suffering by animals are not visible for people. And people often don't want it to be visible because their moral judgments would be triggered, and they're not looking forward to that. One thing that AI makes possible is the visible becoming more visible so that people can see mistreatment and cruelty with respect to animals. And with respect to animals present and future, that's good. So often suffering of any kind persists because people don't see it. And that's a tragedy and also an opportunity where a degree of transparency and visibility is a friend to improvement. We have some data, it's all very preliminary data, about information avoidance and animal welfare. And some of the most interesting data finds that many people don't want to learn about how animals are treated. But if some technology or something informs them of what they don't want to know, their behavior changes. That's because their moral convictions are present and they know that. Once their moral convictions are triggered, meaning just jarred, they think, well, I guess I'll eat something that is associated with less or no cruelty to animals. So animal suffering matters, bedrock, number one. AI-powered choice engines, number two, are an unprecedented opportunity to fuel existing moral convictions in the interest of less in the way of suffering. And three, AI is a way, potentially, to make things that aren't seen. And in this context, at least, that's a recipe for more justice and more kindness. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sunstein. So let's just get right into a discussion. Taking your 3 points, and if I understand, you have a new book coming out that's either already out or coming out relatively soon called On Liberalism, a very famous title in the history of political philosophy. You wrote Standing for Animals in 1999. How do you conceive of animals as fitting in a liberal vision of government and a society?
Great. There are two strands of liberalism that bear on animals. Let's associate the first with Immanuel Kant and the second with Jeremy Bentham. So Kant emphasized respect for persons, emphasized that each of us is a reasoning agent, that we should be treated as subjects and not as objects. Kantianism is often associated with something called deontology, which is central to the liberal tradition. It's connected with the anti-slavery movement. It's connected with feminism. Kant was, what's the right word? The flippant way to say it, he was terrible on animals. I think that's truthful as well as flippant. The more respectful of the great Kant would say that in his time he was consistent with people then who saw animals as a matter of relative moral indifference. And there's a stream of deontological thinking in the liberal tradition that follows Kant. This could get very elaborate, but let's just note that one of the premier current Kantians named Christine Korsgaard, a philosopher at Harvard, you probably know her name, is very much pro-animal and pro-animal rights from a broadly Kantian perspective. And Martha Nussbaum, who's not a Kantian, she's more an Aristotelian, but that's a strand of thought that emphasizes flourishing. Martha Nussbaum is emphatically a liberal. And from her kind of Aristotelian version of the liberal tradition is very much focused on animal flourishing, its centrality to what justice requires. So there's Kant, who has a kind of blind spot, I think, with respect to animals. There are modern Kantians who don't. There are Aristotelian liberals, that's to many an oxymoron, but there are Aristotelian liberals, Nussbaum's one, and Amartya Sen is another. The one that I favor, the form of liberalism that I favor, is rooted in Bentham and Mill. A cough is coming. Forgive a cough. Tried to make it a quiet cough. Bentham and Mill are, broadly speaking, utilitarians. Bentham founded utilitarianism, and Mill kind of elaborated and amended it. Let's just note that both Bentham and Mill were very pro-animal welfare, and that's because they thought, in Bentham's terms, the question is not can they talk or can they reason, it is can they suffer. And that has a commonality with Nussbaum's conception of justice for animals. It is very different from at least Kant's Kant, though there are forms of Kantianism that can make common cause with that. I guess I'd say, this is a little long-winded, I'd say that the liberal tradition, properly interpreted, ultimately sees animal welfare as a compelling thing, which has centrality rather than at the margins, which is central to what liberalism is concerned with and not at the margins. And that's kind of a flowering of liberalism. But in the hands of Bentham and Mill, it was there early on.
Thank you. And you'll be happy to know that yesterday our other keynote speaker was Peter Singer. So I think there's this genealogy of these ideas that we're obviously in this contemporary moment thinking about that goes all the way back to that. If I may, I'll just weave some things in. You sort of quoted that guiding Bentham quote, right? Not talk, not reason, but suffer. We're starting to have AI systems that can seemingly, statistically, and in a meaningfully interactive way talk. We're starting to have scaled inference models that are trying to enable reasoning and being applied to a variety of, whether it's syllogisms or it's mathematical proofs. You're having machine models that are able to do these things. What do you think of machine models that could recognize suffering? And if I may say one last thing to connect that to, you said liberalism properly interpreted. One conception of artificial intelligence, especially legal AI, is exactly that. So that's sort of our challenge, isn't it? So over to you in whichever way is interesting.
And that's great. So here's a little coffee cup. Let's suppose it's a coffee cup from 2038, and let's suppose it's a coffee cup that's capable of reasoning. If this coffee cup falls in water such that it is at risk of being destroyed, it might have a capacity to see its situation, and it might actually have a capacity to do something about it, the coffee cup. But unless the technology changes in an unanticipated way, its capacity to reason and recognize is unaccompanied by feelings. It's more purely pattern recognition. It sees this as a pattern. One of my dogs, who's downstairs right now, you might hear him, had an experience exactly like that 3 days ago. Speaking from Massachusetts, where there's snow and ice, and he ran down a hill on ice and fell in freezing cold water and was, by his own lights, at risk of death because he couldn't get out. Now, my wife was there and would have saved him, but he was, by his own lights, this was recognizably a pattern of death. And he found a way, it was very dramatic, I wasn't there, but he found a way of positioning his front paws on the ice and leaping up on his sixth try to get out of the ice. After he survived the ice, he had about 15 seconds of shaking the ice water off and then started emitting noises of terror and relief that he had gone through this experience. Now, I give this tale just to distinguish between the coffee cup and my dog, and to recognize this as a point for Bentham. So there's a moral obligation on the part of persons proximate to a dog who's at risk of death to save the dog and to prevent the suffering. There's no such obligation on the part of someone proximate to this. Or it might be about wasting technology, but that's a different thing. Now, two qualifications. If this can not only be a coffee holder, but also recognize suffering in other living creatures, it's a multi-purpose thing, then it's a very useful thing. So if it can see that some person or some dog is in trouble, then it's useful. It wouldn't have rights by virtue of that, though we might want to preserve and protect it because it's useful, just as I'm kind of grateful to its existence now because it can hold coffee. Now, if this could recognize, as you say, suffering in others and have a measure, it could tell us who's not feeling well or who's in pain or who's in need. That's great. And then it would be like a doctor. It would be an instrument. Though it wouldn't have rights as such. It would be like a really good toothbrush. Now, the question whether artificial intelligence has free speech rights is super interesting. Unless AI develops emotions, I say, and becomes in that respect more like people, not mimicking emotions, but actually having them, it would not be a rights holder. But the people who interact with AI would be rights holders as listeners. So if you regulate the speech of AI in certain ways, it could violate the rights of people who interact with it. That's to say, basically, Bentham provides a very nice path forward and allows us to make useful distinctions.
Thank you for that. So just building off of that, you started with a coffee cup. Well, let me pull back here. There's maybe a sort of spectrum here of property and personhood. And property, if I know in Roman law, is usus abusus fructus, right? And you have the right to, as you said, the water can come and it can be destroyed and abused and done. And persons ostensibly give signals and then are protected and represented to do that. And then separately, if I'm saying this correctly, there's Executive Order 12866, which said it's important to start to say, how do we value even things that are difficult to quantitatively value? And so when you started to say that you could have some instrument that could measure these things, number one is, let's say you started to have that. How would that plug into cost-benefit analysis and this kind of considerations that you have been a leading thinker on?
Well, thank you for that. In 2011, roughly, when I was in the government, there was a regulation that was designed to put cameras in cars so you can see behind you. It actually went through. It was a regulation from the Department of Transportation. And now all American cars, basically, maybe there's an exception or two, but all of them have cameras so you can see in back. Now, that was in the period a controversial regulation because the costs, at least at the stage of proposal, are pretty high, maybe the vicinity of $1 billion. And the monetizable benefits weren't as high as the costs. So to require cameras in car wasn't self-evident that one should do that. There was discussion in the White House about protection of dogs and other non-human animals from being killed because there were cameras. And I was part of those discussions. I thought that should be counted. The general consensus was we're not ready for that, meaning we don't know whether to do it. We don't know how to do it. We don't have the numbers. There was just caution about that. I think that was a mistake. I think it should have been mentioned. And we were ready to say at least there's some number of non-human animals who will be saved. And that's a non-quantifiable fact that is a point in favor of the regulation. This is just one example of an assortment of regulations where you either know some number will be saved or you have a range of numbers that will be saved. It might be a regulation that protects dogs specifically from being hurt in certain ways, or it might be a regulation that protects endangered species. An air pollution regulation is going to prevent some number of deaths for non-human animals. This is a very serious and I think indefensible gap in the operation of regulatory impact analysis. Now, the first thing to do, kind of the most modest thing to do, is to say, here's a fact, some number of animals will be saved from death and illness. That is an impact. If you're doing regulatory impact analysis, that has to be said. Or if there's a regulation that's going to result in the death of some number of non-human animals, that has to be said. So let's start out by just acknowledging a fact, if it's known to be a fact. Second, it may be that there's a range of numbers of animals that we can identify. So we know the number is more than 50 and under 200 maybe. Let's say that. Then there's the question of monetization. That is turning animal losses into some sort of monetary equivalent. And if that seems kind of creepy and terrible, it's done for people. So the value of a statistical life, that means a human life, is in the vicinity of $13 million. That's on the Department of Transportation's website. It's not a secret. And that $13 million might sound kind of creepy. It's not really the value of a human life. It's the value of a risk to human beings. And then you do some multiplication to get the 13 million. So if it's How much are people going to pay to avoid a risk of 1 in 10,000? How much would they have to be paid? And if this whole endeavor seems terrible, it's going to have to occur, at least implicitly, whenever we decide on how protective to be. We're not going to eliminate automobiles. We're not going to, even though they're going to be highway deaths, like a lot, we're not going to, I hope, stop having safety regulation. We're going to have that. Where do we go between eliminating automobiles and existing levels of safety? There's at least an implicit judgment about how much it's worth. So do that for animals. So first, basically state it as a fact. That's what was done with respect, by the way, to the fact that children were being protected from the cameras of the cars. It was said we don't know whether to give more money when it's a little kid than if it's a grown-up, but we recognize that they're little kids and they're getting killed, and we're going to say that. And so the process of cost-benefit analysis is sometimes informed by the non-quantifiable. And to say this is a work in progress, I can say I took a couple runs at it in the last years, getting the U.S. government to recognize this. And I didn't succeed, but the day is young. It's a project. Recognize that the loss of animal lives, that is a loss.
Thank you. There were two questions that came out of that, but I'll just ask the first one very quickly. You said, the room said, we're not ready for that. And of course, you've been advocating for it, and we are cheering that effort and trying to be part of that effort. What makes the room ready, and how does this potentially relate to your theories of nudge and choice architecture in terms of, the pace of change?
Great. So that's a great question. So I want to think about it a little bit. In 2009, 2010, some people thought when it was raised that dogs will be saved, cats, potentially other animals. Some people thought that was a silly point. And so we're not ready in the sense that it's kind of a joke. Why would anyone care about that? And I think that's somewhere between an unthinking thought and a cruel thought. And we're beyond that now, I think. People don't think that now as much as they did then. We're not ready could have a second, less unthinking and cruel face, which is to think, what do we do with that? Dogs will be saved. What do we do with that? We don't know we don't know the number, and we don't know the valuation. So we're not ready because we just don't have the information. And the valuation is, we don't have any data, the monetization. So if people aren't laughing or made awkward by the point, then they think, do we have data? And the first run of data is to say, well, how many dogs die in back-over crashes? How many died in 2019? This is knowable. Among facts that the government assembles, that's not one of the hardest. And it might be the data, we have a lower bound from what's reported, and then we might know, what multiple of the lower bound gets us realistic. And you get the people who work on this kind of thing, you can probably get some pretty decent numbers. There's a paper in the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis that is, I think it's called, it has a silly name, Monetizing Bowser or something, that tries to figure out what's the value of a statistical life of a dog. And as I remember, it's roughly in the vicinity of $60,000. And you can question or something the data. You could consider that a lower bound. But now we have some stuff. So if we save 200 dogs, multiply that times, let's say, roughly 100,000, we're talking about real money. And that would filter into the government's analysis about what to do. I think if we had an agreement on the part of the government that losses of animal lives, and AI can help with this, that they are part of the effects, either beneficial or negative, of regulation, that would be a huge step forward.
Absolutely. And it seems that in a sense, it's also, there's a family law interest in terms of people thinking about dogs and companion animals and cats as part of them. That's a motivation for that potentially happening in society. You sort of spoke about value of saved lives, and there's these other metrics, qualities, and these kind of things. At the start, you gave us a history of liberalism, and then you've brought up, driving, and then even self-driving, and as is sort of the contemporary example that everyone likes, trolley problems with self-driving cars. But as you know, the history of trolley problems is Philippa Foot saying these different approaches, deontology, contractualism, utilitarianism, how do we synthesize them? With Parfit, can we climb the mountain and bring it together? So one question is there a teleology or a trajectory ahead where you're saying these AI systems are going to have to weigh their decisions, and they're to some degree probably going to have to account for their turn of the wheel. Is that just a number, and is that number just money for essentially saying we turned these wheels and made these decisions, and this is the price point of all lives in relationship to our cyborg society, if you want to go all that way. So over to you.
Well, in my view, the right approach emphasizes welfare. That's the maxim end. How much welfare do we get? Certainly in the context of health and safety regulations or environmental regulations. And that the trolley problem is infrequently relevant to issues about how strict should a clean air regulation be, or what should we do about highway safety regulation. It's not never relevant, but it's infrequently relevant. Where it's relevant, I say, this is going to be kind of controversial, but I think that the intuitions that make the trolley problem relevant are unreliable. So that if we have an intuition, you wouldn't pull the switch to kill one to save five. You wouldn't push someone to save five, push that one and save four on net, but you would pull the switch. I think this is all heuristics that we have in our mind that are good heuristics, which is you don't push one to death, and you have a very red light in that about pushing people, but you devise a scenario in which the only way to save, let's say, our species is to push one person. Probably should do the pushing. Now, if that seems self-evident that, well, it's to save $100 million, would you do the pushing? Absolutely. If it's 50,000, would you push? I say yes, but there are good utilitarian reasons why people, all of us, I hope, think the idea of pushing someone to his or her death is an abomination. There are good reasons for that. But if some clever person devises a scenario in which pushing someone is the only way to save X number of people, then if it's really a clean case, in my view, you go the welfarist route. So the deontological or other intuitions that are anti-utilitarian or welfarist typically have a utilitarian or welfarist justification, like my dog I care more about than other dogs. Probably dogs are a lot better off because the people who live with them particularly care about them, at least in a range of cases. But I don't know what to think about Parfit's brilliant effort to say that they all kind of converge. There are cases in which they clearly don't converge. And in my view, we go the welfarist route where they don't. In the regulatory context, welfarism is the coin of the realm. And you can gin up kind of deontological constraints, but they're not really relevant. In a case in which you're deciding, should the regulation of ozone be 70 parts per X, or should it be 60 parts per X, or maybe 65 parts per X? The only point is, if you go down lower, you'll be protecting more non-human animals. And is that a matter of indifference? That would be an extremely odd thought, that it's a matter of indifference, that you're saving more animals, even if they aren't people.
Thank you. Maybe just to go to a slightly different area. Question at this conference is on how we can move towards building AI for animals in all the variety of places where it would impact the lives of animals. And so one talk that may interest you was an effort to use LLMs to simulate willingness to pay for data regarding, let's say, caged versus cage-free eggs or other aspects where you have these elements in there. And there's some other ones I can bring up later, but do you have any thoughts on how AI can help us have a clearer understanding of problems that we want to either quantify or have a good basis of making decisions on?
That's very cool. So thank you for that. I'm thinking whether the elicitation of willingness to pay for, let's say, better conditions, is that based on something that we can trust? That would be really interesting to know. I was just using AI on something involving behavioral economics, and it hallucinated papers that didn't exist. I was asking for papers on a certain topic, and it generated ones that aren't real. So I'm wondering what the foundation of the willingness to pay number is. Here's a project I'd love to see people who can do this do. Generate choice engines for consumers that are animal friendly, so that when you make consumption choices, it could involve food, it could involve clothing, it could involve anything. Have a choice engine that will tell you what the better approach is if you care about animals, and what the much better approach is. So it could be cheapest, it could be animal friendly, and it could be animal friendliest. And routinize that in some domain at Berkeley or in Ann Arbor, where people can just say, what are my options? And then you can see the three. And it has some behavioral logic to it, as well as being just about informing consumers and being on neoclassical grounds, fine. So neoclassical grounds, if this is part of what people care about, let them know. On behavioral grounds, it could operate as a very soft nudge by making salient something or by connecting to a moral conviction to which people don't normally pay much attention. So Berkeley's the place for it. Yeah, a choice engine that helps people make choices that are animal friendlier. A lot of Americans would really like that, even if the idea of animal rights makes them think, I'm going to vote for the Republicans. But the idea of something that's animal friendly, or they probably love, some animal, they might live with some animal. And so I see this as part of something that renders, consistent with some of Peter Singer's stuff, makes the invisible things become more visible. Here's another thought, that there are people all over our country who are, at least to some extent, concerned about animal welfare, and maybe in some sense animal rights, who silence themselves because they don't want to look like that kind of person around their neighbors. So it's a little like religious conservatives, let's say, until recently, or conservatives on some college campuses until recently, maybe now even, who didn't say what they thought because of fear of opprobrium. So they shut up. And they didn't know that their conviction was widely held. Now, for animals, this is something I did a book about, I fear, but this is something that is very pervasive, where people's moral convictions or what they care about, they don't let other people know because they think that they're alone, or alone in their community. Now, an AI-powered choice engine that could help people make animal-friendliest choices could spur people to say, I like that. I don't like Democrats much, or I'm not a political person really, but if I do something that makes cows die less badly or not die at all, that's better. How do I do that? It's hard to know often for people.
That's a great setup. I just want to probably open it up to the audience in a moment, but I think your setup of what's an animal-friendly AI as a choice engine that helps more people come out and form those political communities is a great direction. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Thanks for being with us, Professor Sunstein. You mentioned Coast Guard and Nussbaum. Both of those, as well as some of the contemporary utilitarians, have started talking about the ethics of interacting with wild animals. They don't have exactly settled opinions about how we should engage with these animals, but there seems to be a convergence that they might be moral patients or that we should be thinking about this question more. And I'm curious if you have any takes about how we should think about our responsibilities to animals in the wild outside the human domain?
It's a great question. So let's agree with Singer that if our interactions with wild animals make them scared or in distress, we had better have a very good justification for that. And let's agree with Nussbaum that if the animals are made not to flourish, if they're given a life that's inconsistent with what that animal's life is, if it's flourishing, then that's a wrong also. Now, it might be that it's overridden. Maybe we're acting in self-defense, or maybe we're acting to protect other animals, or maybe even there's some very strong economic reason, which is consistent with the well-being of human beings and other non-human animals. All of those things are relevant. But let's just say it's a prima facie wrong. If we're not helping wild animals, that's a question I know on which Nussbaum in particular has written preliminarily. But if we're not helping wild animals, not as self-evidently a wrong, but it's a little like duties of help for human beings who are suffering, a little bit obligations of people in wealthy countries to help people in poor countries, especially for conditions maybe that they're responsible for creating, but maybe even if they aren't. Offhand, if you could just go like that and prevent an animal from dying, you probably should go like that. Didn't hurt very much, it was fine. And a lot would depend on the magnitude of the benefit to the animal and the magnitude of the harm to the human beings who are helping the animal. And you see my welfarist blockheadedness is coming out.
Thank you. I'm a big fan, and it's an honor to hear you talk. So thanks so much. I came up as a civil litigator through the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I work at the Non-Human Rights Project now. And so I've been thinking a lot about the psychology and behavior of judges, which I think you might know a bit about. So I'm wondering if you've thought sort of about the intersection of, studying behavior perhaps through AI, and also the decision-making behavior of judges who are ruling on cases. One thing that strikes me in particular was your story about considering the interests of dogs in the regulatory context, and there was sort of a knee-jerk reaction against it. And I see that knee-jerk reaction a lot whenever we're rolling out maybe a novel legal argument that has a sound and reasonable basis, to see just like a very knee-jerk reaction dismissal of it. So I've really sort of come to think that it's the psychology of judges is what's really a barrier for at least people trying to use the legal system to help animals. So just any thoughts about that?
It's a great question. So let's distinguish between Burke and Bentham, if we might. And Judge Posner, who was a big utilitarian, founder of law and economics, wrote a little essay somewhere about Burke. And Burke was a tradition-focused guy. And you'd expect Posner to look down on Burke as an idiot. You need a framework, because Posner was the primary popularizer of lawyers should use economics. But he was very nice to Burke. He said, you can't just read Burke and have a legal philosophy. Something like Burke is the right spirit in which to do law. So I'm backing into your question. You can imagine a Burkean animal rights litigator, or animals litigator, let's bracket rights, or a Benthamite, where the Benthamite would go into court with let's say, a theory, and then, as you say, a novel account, which might fit with the theory, maybe animals or persons, something like that. And then a judge would think, the judge wouldn't say, I'm a Burkean, but a judge is a Burkean. They work with their categories. It's kind of psychology. It's also almost like upbringing, which is, what do I know? I know tort law. I know property law if it's a state court. I can build on animal welfare. There are laws like that. But if there's something that kind of explodes, so if it's like the French Revolution, which Burke didn't like very much, the judges don't like anything that looks like the French Revolution. So if it's something that says, we have animal welfare rights and we have animal welfare laws, and what we're trying to do is use or build on the commitments that are there, judges tend to find that genial. If you look at what happened in tort law in California, in the world of products liability, where Judge Traynor did all sorts of stuff, it was all Burkean. It wasn't in the grip of a big theory. So sometimes the big theories work. I clerked for Thurgood Marshall, so maybe this is relevant. And if you look, I talked to him about how he got rid of racial segregation. It was very much of a building on existing stuff and saying separate isn't equal there, and then separate was being equal nowhere. And then after preparing the way, he argued separate is inherently unequal. And it must have felt like, snail movement for the lawyers and people who were living under segregation, but it was a rocket movement in the system of law from the late 1930s to 1954. That's pretty fast to get rid of segregation in the United States. So we need something maybe like an NCAA legal defense fund for AI and animal welfare that starts with small victories and maybe has an ultimate vision. But by the time the ultimate vision is maybe potentially going to be accepted, it will seem like kind of obvious. That's what Marshall did.
Please.
Thanks for speaking to us today. You've had success in a number of different domains, like legal, political, academic. I'm curious if you were giving advice to somebody who was, say, fresh out of college today, given the sort of technological landscape, given the prospects for animals generally, what would you recommend as a most promising career trajectory if you wanted to maximize your impact for animals?
Well, thank you for that. I'm thinking that to do something that would maximize your career trajectory, that's really hard, especially because life has so much surprise in it. So if I thought, what will maximize my career trajectory, I don't think I would have made the choices I did. I think what has worked out so far, not terribly for me, is when I find something I'm super interested in, do it. So I'm thinking if there's something you're really interested in where the doing of it makes you energized and eager to get going, then you're probably on a good track. My wife, who had a pretty mediocre education in the early days, it was good, but it wasn't something that would lead her to be UN ambassador. She had a meteoric rise, and it was really because she was following what she liked best and doing things that she thought were just extremely interesting to learn about. So I'm thinking in her case, she did things that were really brave. She went to become a reporter in war zones. But if you are just keenly interested in learning about something and using it in some way that involves AI, that's what I would do. And what the path ultimately is going to be, it really depends on things that you don't have control over. But if you're fascinated by it, nothing can go terribly wrong, and something might go super right.
Thanks, Professor Sunstein. What, in your view, is the most plausible theory of change for achieving really fast, transformative change for animals?
I think it would focus on the fact, this is in terms of large scale, that people's moral judgments aren't consistent with their behavior, and aren't in many cases consistent even with what they say. So that's why the opportunity is there, where people are contributing to outcomes that don't fit their own moral judgments, contributing outcomes where animals suffer, or where they're not saying things. So I think that's the foundational opportunity. If this is obscure, here's some data for you. It's a study from Saudi Arabia from pretty recently, where young men in Saudi Arabia were asked, what would they think if their wives worked outside of the home? And the strong majority said, that's great, I'm all for that. And then they asked, what do they think other young men in Saudi Arabia think? And they said, I think most young men think it's bad. They don't want their wives working outside of the home. Then some percentage of the men who had the false impression were corrected. They were told, actually, your view is widely held, that young men in your community in Saudi Arabia, they're good with their wives working outside of the home. Now, here's the cool thing. In short order, the men who were so informed, and this is a large sample, their wives started applying for jobs outside of the home. So the men actually wanted it or were good with it. And the block was they thought other men weren't. Once they were informed they were, then we got at least a step toward more in the way of sex equality. And I think that the animal one is similar. Now, of course, people like eating lamb and they like eating beef. But other things being equal, they'd like eating lamb and beef where there wasn't cruelty and horror in the production. And many people, I think, would think, probably more than we know, if there's some fake meat that is good, I'd prefer that. If they knew that the fake meat didn't involve animal suffering and the meat involved animal suffering. So I'll shift to that. Would you pay a penny? I'd pay a penny. Now, some people wouldn't, but I'll tell you something that maybe is related to your question, that with President Obama, when I was there were very large problems, as any president faces, like immigration or climate change or clean air or crime. And his advisors in the White House, we'd often think, what we have to meet the problem is inadequate to the magnitude of the problem. So we'd go in to see him in the Oval Office and we wouldn't have what was adequate. And he'd notice, he's a very emotionally tuned person, he'd notice that his advisors were a little abashed that they couldn't solve immigration or climate change. And here's what he'd say, and he did this repeatedly. He'd look at us and he'd say, better is good. Just 3 words, meaning you may not be able to change the world, but you can change someone's world. And so with respect to animals, if there's something that is, a dent, better is good.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk. It was really incredible, and your work is just transformative and fantastic across the board. But this is maybe a funny question coming on the heels of the comment about better being good. But I'm curious about your thoughts on these choice engines in addition to helping people make choices that align with their existing values, how maybe they could help shift them towards, I think, the values that many of us at this conference share. And one of the things that I'm thinking is, from my experience, people tend to have a lot more empathy towards pigs and cows, per se, than chickens or fish. So I'm curious if you think there's a potential for the choice engines to begin as something that helps people show more compassion and kindness to species they already care a lot about, and how that could eventually sort of extend beyond that to other species who they tend to not care as much about.
Well, I love that question. Thank you for that. That's great. So one thing is where people have a value or a preference and they just don't know how to promote it. And let's call that choice engine 1.0. The other is people have a value or preference, but it's kind of submerged because they think it's inconsistent with what most people think, and they're a little maybe embarrassed by it. That's how I was about animals, by the way, for a number of years, just embarrassed. I had the conviction, but I thought, what will other people think? It's like not wearing a tie. Let's call that 2.0. Where you're licensing people to express values, or maybe even spurring their expression where they'd been a little shamed. And then you're talking about 3.0, extending the sphere of, let's say, sympathy and concern. That should be so doable, and it could work through text, it could work through pictures. I mean, if you see a picture of an animal, let's say, that isn't one that's normally on your view screen, and say you can save 7 of those or 700 of those by doing this rather than that. That's a choice engine which is more prescriptive than one that just connects with what you already thought. But I think that's a great flower to see bloom.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Sunstein, for this wide-ranging and very specific guiding conversation, I think. We hope that some of the ideas that were pulled out of this conversation and that have also been discussed at this overall conference of there are things we can build. Maybe we can build an NAACP for AI for animals and how we can do a better job from small victories to a day when we win are in all of our sites. So thank you again, Professor Sunstein. Everyone, if we could please give him a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks all.